The courtroom was already full long before the judge arrived. People sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, whispering quietly as they waited. The air felt heavy, like everyone knew this would not be an ordinary day. At the front of the room, the seal of the court hung on the wall, reminding everyone that this place was meant to stand for fairness and order, yet something about the atmosphere felt uneasy and tight. A black woman stood near the defense table, her hands rested calmly at her sides, and her posture was straight. She was not loud, and she was not angry, but her eyes showed strength and awareness. She had been in this system before, and she understood how quickly things could change. She wore simple clothes, nothing fancy, but she carried herself with dignity, as if she refused to let the room define her worth. Across the room, several police officers stood close together. Their uniforms were neat, their faces serious, and their arms crossed tightly over their chests. They watched the woman closely, more closely than anyone else in the room. Every small movement she made seemed to catch their attention. The officers believed they were in control. This was their territory, or so they thought. The judge's bench stood empty for the moment, slightly raised above everyone else. It was a symbol of authority and final decisions. The woman glanced toward it briefly, not with fear, but with thoughtfulness. She knew the power that seat carried, and she also knew how often that power failed people who looked like her. The murmurs in the courtroom grew softer as the clerk prepared documents. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, and someone coughed in the back row. The quiet felt unnatural, like the pause before a storm. People sensed tension but could not explain why. Some spectators leaned forward, curious, others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with what might unfold. The woman's case was supposed to be simple, nothing about it should have drawn attention, yet her presence seemed to challenge the room, not because she demanded it, but because she refused to shrink. She stood calmly, even as eyes judged her before a word was spoken. She understood that in places like this, silence could be mistaken for weakness. When the judge finally entered, everyone rose to their feet. The woman stood tall along with everyone else. The judge took his seat, glanced around the room, and began the session in a routine manner. His voice was steady, but his eyes moved quickly, scanning faces. The officers straightened even more, clearly ready for anything. As the proceedings began, the woman listened carefully. She did not interrupt, she did not show frustration, she waited for her moment to speak. Her calmness seemed to irritate the officers more than anger would have. They shifted their weight, whispered among themselves, and watched her every breath. The judge addressed her directly, asking simple questions. She answered clearly and respectfully. Her voice was steady, and her words were chosen with care. Each sentence showed that she understood her rights and her position. Some people in the courtroom exchanged looks, surprised by her confidence. The tension continued to grow, like an invisible line being pulled tighter and tighter. The officers stepped slightly closer, their presence looming. The woman noticed but did not react. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to be intimidated. Her silence was powerful. Everyone in the room could feel that something was off. This was not just a legal proceeding, it was a test of control, patience, and respect. The courtroom, meant to be a place of justice, now felt like a pressure cooker. One wrong move could change everything. As the judge turned to review paperwork, the woman took a slow breath. She had no idea that in just moments, her life would shift in a way no one could imagine. The room held its breath with her, unaware that the tense calm was about to shatter, and that this courtroom would soon witness a moment that would be remembered far beyond its walls. The moment the judge began asking questions, the quiet tension in the courtroom slowly turned into open discomfort. The woman answered politely, but there was a firmness in her voice that made it clear she would not be spoken over or misunderstood. She did not raise her tone, yet every word carried weight. That calm confidence seemed to unsettle the officers standing nearby. One officer shifted closer to her, his boots scraping lightly against the floor. It was a small sound, but in the silent room it felt loud, almost intentional. The woman noticed but did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the judge, showing respect for the court, even when others were not showing respect for her. The judge asked another question, this time about a detail in the report. The woman paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully, then she pointed out a contradiction. Her voice remained steady, but the truth in her statement hung in the air. Some people in the audience stirred, sensing the shift. The officers exchanged quick looks, their faces tightened. They were not used to being questioned, especially not by someone they believed should remain silent. One of them interrupted her before she could finish her sentence. His tone was sharp, dismissive. The woman calmly asked to finish speaking. Her request was simple, respectful, and completely reasonable, but the room reacted as if she had crossed a line. The officer took another step forward, invading her space. The balance of power began to tilt. The judge raised a hand, signaling for order, but the damage was already done. The woman's calm had exposed something deeper, an unspoken struggle for control. She was not arguing, she was not resisting, she was simply refusing to be erased. Whispers spread through the courtroom. Some spectators leaned forward, sensing conflict. Others looked away, knowing how quickly situations like this could turn dangerous. The woman remained still, her hands visible, her posture calm. She knew that any sudden movement could be used against her. Another officer spoke, questioning her attitude, accusing her of being uncooperative. The words felt unfair, almost rehearsed. The woman responded with facts, not emotion. She explained herself clearly, making it obvious she understood the law and her rights. That knowledge seemed to anger them more. The officers were used to obedience, not understanding. They wanted submission, not clarity. The tension thickened, wrapping around the room like fog. The judge attempted to regain control, asking everyone to calm down, but his voice lacked authority now. The officers had already taken over the moment. The woman noticed the judge's hesitation, and in that brief second, she understood something important. The system she stood in was not as solid as it pretended to be. She straightened her shoulders slightly, not in defiance, but in self-respect. Her eyes remained calm, even as the situation escalated. She spoke again, firmly but respectfully, stating that she had the right to complete her answer. That sentence changed everything. The officers saw it as a challenge. The courtroom felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. One officer raised his voice, demanding compliance. Still, the woman did not shout, she did not cry, she did not step back. Her strength was quiet, controlled, and unshaken. The contrast between her composure and their aggression became impossible to ignore. People in the audience held their breath, sensing that the moment was slipping beyond reason. This was no longer about a case, it was about authority being questioned, about control being threatened. The woman felt it too, that deep instinctive warning that told her things were about to turn. She stayed calm anyway, trusting herself more than the chaos around her. In that charged silence, with every eye locked on her and every officer standing too close, the conflict reached its breaking point. What began as simple words had now turned into a dangerous struggle for power, and no one in that courtroom was prepared for what would happen next. For a moment after the strike, no one moved. The courtroom fell into a strange, heavy silence, as if the air itself had stopped flowing. The sound of breathing felt loud, chairs creaked softly as people shifted in shock, but no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that comes after something terrible happens, when the mind struggles to understand what the eyes have just seen. The woman stood exactly where she was. Her body was still, almost unnaturally so. She did not cry out, she did not argue, she did not fall. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief second, not in weakness, but in control, as if grounding herself before the world rushed back in. The officers froze too, their confidence vanished in an instant. One of them took a half step back, then stopped, unsure of what to do next. Another glanced toward the judge, waiting for guidance that did not come. The authority they believed they owned suddenly felt fragile. The judge sat stiffly behind the bench, his face pale, his hands rested on the desk, unmoving. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The courtroom had never felt so exposed. Every eye turned toward him, waiting for justice to speak, but it remained silent. The court clerk stared down at the desk, pretending to focus on paperwork. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably near the door, unsure whether to step in or stay back. Everyone seemed afraid of making the wrong move, as if the rules they relied on no longer applied. In the audience, reactions spread quietly. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, tears filled her eyes. A man clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger. Others stared straight ahead, their faces blank, protecting themselves from the weight of what they had just witnessed. The woman slowly opened her eyes and lifted her head. Her gaze moved across the room, not accusing, not afraid, just aware. She saw the fear, the guilt, the hesitation, and the shock reflected back at her, and in that moment, she understood something important. The silence was not weakness, it was exposure. She adjusted her stance slightly, steadying herself. Her breathing was slow and controlled. She refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. The pain was real, but she did not let it define her. The officers finally stepped back, not because they were ordered to, but because the room itself seemed to push them away. Their presence now felt uncomfortable, almost embarrassing. They avoided looking at the audience, at the judge, and especially at her. The judge cleared his throat. The sound echoed louder than expected. He called for a brief pause. His voice lacked confidence, and everyone could hear it. The pause felt like an escape, not a solution. As people waited, the silence stretched on. Each second felt longer than the last. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of order. It felt like a mirror, reflecting the truth no one wanted to see. The woman remained standing throughout it all. She was not told to sit, and she did not ask. Her stillness carried meaning. It said she was present, aware, and unwilling to disappear. In that quiet aftermath, something shifted beneath the surface. The violence had failed to silence her. Instead, it had stripped away the illusion of control. People would later struggle to describe that moment. Some would say it was uncomfortable, others would say it was frightening, but those who truly understood would say it was revealing. The silence was not empty, it was full of questions, guilt, and unspoken truth. It was the sound of a system pausing, unsure of how to move forward now that its flaws had been exposed. And as the courtroom remained still, one thing became clear: this moment was not an ending, it was a turning point. The quiet after the strike was only the beginning of something far bigger, something that would force everyone in that room to face what justice really meant. What happened next was something no one in the courtroom expected. The pause ordered by the judge stretched longer than usual. During that time, court officials moved quietly, whispering near the bench. Faces looked serious, confused, and tense. The judge's authority seemed shaken, as if the ground beneath his seat was no longer steady. The woman remained standing, silent but alert. She watched everything closely, noticing details others missed: the way the judge avoided eye contact, the way officers stayed unusually still, the way court staff looked unsure of their own roles. Something behind the scenes was shifting fast. A senior court officer approached the bench and handed the judge a document. The judge read it once, then again. His expression changed, not anger, not fear, but realization. The room sensed it immediately. The air grew thick with anticipation. The judge cleared his throat and spoke carefully, announcing that due to an immediate legal conflict and procedural violation, he could not continue overseeing the session. His words were formal, but their meaning hit hard. Murmurs spread through the audience, confusion mixed with shock. The woman lifted her head slightly, listening closely. She understood the law better than most people assumed. She knew what a conflict of authority meant. She knew what came next. The judge hesitated, then announced that under emergency court procedure, a qualified legal official present in the courtroom would temporarily assume control of the proceedings. All eyes scanned the room, searching for answers. Then the judge looked directly at her. The silence that followed was deafening. The courtroom froze as the realization settled in. The woman was not just a defendant, she was a licensed legal professional who had been present due to an unresolved jurisdiction matter, something that had been overlooked, ignored, or underestimated until now. The officers stiffened, their faces drained of color. The power they believed they held slipped away in real time. The woman stepped forward slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. Every step echoed through the courtroom, each movement felt symbolic. The distance between where she stood moments ago and the judge's seat felt larger than it actually was. She stopped briefly, looking around the room. She did not smile, she did not look proud. Her expression was calm, focused, and steady. This was not about revenge, this was about responsibility. With quiet confidence, she took her place at the bench. The sound of the chair shifting beneath her carried weight. The judge stood and stepped aside, his authority now transferred. The courtroom struggled to process what it was witnessing. The woman who had been struck minutes earlier now sat where decisions were made, where power lived, where justice was supposed to begin. She adjusted the microphone gently and spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and controlled. She acknowledged the court, the audience, and the seriousness of the moment. There was no anger in her tone, only clarity. She immediately addressed the incident, stating that an act of violence had occurred in the courtroom and that it would be formally recorded. Her words carried weight now, not because they had changed, but because the seat she occupied had. The officers stood frozen, their authority evaporated, replaced by accountability. For the first time since the incident began, they were the ones being observed, measured, and judged. The audience watched in disbelief, some with wide eyes, some with tears, some with quiet nods of respect. The shift was undeniable. The woman continued with precision, ordering an official review, requesting witness statements, and ensuring the courtroom remained calm. Her leadership was firm but fair. In that moment, the power structure had completely reversed. The one who had been treated as powerless now held responsibility over the room. This was not a dramatic victory, it was a quiet one, built on knowledge, restraint, and strength. And as the courtroom adjusted to this new reality, everyone present understood they were witnessing something rare, a moment where justice did not just speak, it moved, sat down, and took control. The moment she settled into the judge's seat, the energy in the courtroom shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was powerful, like the slow turning of a tide that no one could stop. The officers who once stood tall now looked uncertain, their shoulders stiff, their eyes unsure where to rest. She sat upright, calm and steady, letting the silence work for her. She did not rush to speak. She understood that authority was not proven by speed or volume, but by control. The room waited, every person aware that something historic was unfolding. When she finally spoke, her voice was even and composed. She addressed the courtroom with clarity, reminding everyone that this space was meant for justice, not fear. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Each sentence felt deliberate, measured, and impossible to dismiss. The officers shifted uncomfortably as she looked directly at them, not with anger, not with revenge, but with expectation, the kind that demands responsibility. She asked them to step forward and state their names for the record. The request was calm, but the meaning behind it was strong. For the first time since the confrontation began, the officers hesitated. Their authority had vanished, replaced by accountability. They complied slowly, their voices lower than before. The courtroom listened closely, every name echoing like a reminder that actions now had consequences. She acknowledged witnesses in the room, court staff, spectators, and officials. She instructed the clerk to document everything that had occurred without omission. Her command was firm yet respectful, restoring order without intimidation. The audience watched in silence. Many had never seen power handled this way. No shouting, no threats, just confidence built on knowledge and fairness. Some people nodded quietly, others wiped tears from their eyes. The officers who once dominated the space now stood exposed, their movements careful, their presence restrained. The imbalance of power that once favored them had disappeared. The room no longer belonged to force, it belonged to truth. She paused briefly, allowing the weight of the moment to settle, then she addressed the incident directly, stating that violence in a courtroom was unacceptable under any circumstance. Her words were recorded, preserved, and undeniable. The judge who had stepped aside remained silent nearby, watching, learning. His authority had not been taken from him, it had been surpassed. She continued guiding the proceedings, restoring structure piece by piece. Each instruction was clear, each decision fair. The courtroom slowly regained its rhythm, but it was not the same as before. It was more alert, more aware. The officers were instructed to remain present but silent, their role reduced to observers rather than enforcers. The shift was complete. People in the audience would later say that this was the most powerful part of the entire event, not the strike, not the shock, but the calm control that followed. She did not punish in anger, she did not shame, she led, and that leadership exposed the difference between authority given by force and authority earned through integrity. As the session continued, the room seemed to breathe again, slowly, carefully. The fear that once filled the space began to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar but welcome, trust. The woman who had entered the courtroom as a defendant now shaped its outcome, not by raising her voice, but by standing firmly in truth. In that moment, power did not scream, it spoke softly, clearly, and with purpose, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing a rare reversal, one where justice did not just survive, it took control. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of comfort for the officers who had once controlled it. The balance had shifted completely, and with that shift came consequences that could no longer be avoided. The woman, seated at the bench, did not rush toward punishment. She understood that real accountability was not about anger, but about process. She began by stating that the events which had just occurred would trigger an immediate and formal review. Her voice was steady, carrying no emotion beyond seriousness. She ordered the clerk to read back the recorded sequence of events, ensuring that nothing was altered, nothing softened, and nothing erased. As the words were spoken aloud, the reality of the situation became heavier. Hearing the incident described in official language stripped away excuses. The strike was no longer an action lost in chaos, it was now a documented violation. She then instructed internal affairs representatives, already present in the building, to step forward. Their presence added weight to the moment. This was no longer a courtroom incident, it was an investigation. The officers were informed that they were being placed under immediate review pending further inquiry, their weapons were secured, and their authority temporarily suspended. The commands were delivered calmly, professionally, and without hesitation. The officers listened in silence, their earlier confidence completely gone. They no longer stood as enforcers of the law, they stood as subjects of it. Witnesses were asked to remain available. The audience members who had watched everything unfold realized they were now part of history. Each person understood that their words mattered, that truth depended on collective honesty. The woman emphasized that accountability was not an attack on law enforcement, but a protection of justice. Her words reframed the moment. This was not about sides, it was about standards. The judge who had stepped aside watched quietly, perhaps realizing that this was how authority was meant to function, without fear, without favoritism. Court staff moved efficiently now, the earlier confusion replaced by purpose. The system, once shaken, was reassembling itself around integrity. The officers were escorted to the side of the courtroom, no handcuffs, no spectacle, just procedure. That restraint spoke volumes. It showed that justice did not need humiliation to be effective. The woman addressed the courtroom one final time on the matter, stating that no one was above the law, not officers, not officials, not even the system itself. Her words settled deeply into the room. Outside the courtroom, news of the incident began to spread, phones buzzed quietly, reporters gathered. The story was no longer contained within those walls. Inside, however, the focus remained on doing things correctly, every step documented, every decision transparent. Those present would later describe this part not as dramatic, but as powerful. The true strength of the moment was not the reversal of roles, but the restoration of fairness. The officers who once believed the room belonged to them now understood something they had ignored: authority without accountability is fragile. As the proceedings moved forward, the woman ensured that the original case would be rescheduled under neutral supervision. Fairness applied not just to her, but to everyone involved. This decision earned quiet respect from many in the room. She had not used her position to gain advantage, only to restore balance. The consequences were set in motion, slowly but firmly, like stones dropped into water. The impact would spread far beyond that day. And as the courtroom prepared to adjourn, one truth was undeniable: justice had not just been defended, it had been enforced, calmly, clearly, and without compromise. By the time the courtroom finally emptied, the story had already begun to travel far beyond those walls. What happened that day did not stay locked inside legal records or quiet conversations. It moved quickly, carried by witnesses, whispers, and stunned disbelief. People knew they had seen something rare. Outside the building, small groups gathered, talking in low voices, replaying every detail. Some were angry, some were inspired, some were still trying to understand how a moment of violence had turned into a moment of justice. News spread fast, first through phones, then through headlines, and finally through conversations across cities and communities. The image of a woman struck in court and then calmly taking control of that same court struck a deep nerve. For many, the story became a symbol, not just of one incident, but of years of frustration, silence, and imbalance. People who had felt powerless saw themselves in her calm strength. People who had lost faith in the system paused to reconsider what accountability could look like. The woman herself did not seek attention. After the proceedings, she left the courtroom quietly. No cameras, no speeches, no celebration. Her focus was not on fame, but on what had been set in motion. In the days that followed, investigations moved forward, reports were reviewed, statements were collected. The process was slow, but it was real, and for once, many felt that the system was actually working the way it was supposed to. Community leaders spoke about the incident, teachers discussed it in classrooms, families talked about it at dinner tables. The story became a lesson, not one about anger, but about restraint, knowledge, and courage. What stood out most to people was not the strike itself, but what came after, the refusal to respond with hate, the decision to lead instead of lash out, the understanding that real power comes from control, not force. For young people watching from a distance, the story offered something rare, a reminder that dignity can survive even in hostile spaces, that knowledge can protect when strength is tested. The courtroom itself returned to routine, but it was not the same. Those who worked there felt it. Something had changed, an invisible line had been crossed, and once crossed, it could not be ignored. The officers involved faded from the spotlight, their actions now part of a larger conversation about accountability, training, oversight, responsibility. The woman returned to her life, carrying the weight of what she had experienced, but also the quiet pride of knowing she had stood firm. She did not define herself by what was done to her, but by how she responded. Over time, the story settled into something larger than a single event. It became a reminder that justice is not automatic, it must be protected, demanded, and sometimes reclaimed. People would retell the story in different ways, some focusing on the shock, others on the reversal, but those who truly understood focused on the message. Power does not belong to those who shout the loudest, it belongs to those who remain steady when everything around them is shaking. The legacy of that day was not just a headline, it was a shift in perspective, a moment that proved change does not always arrive with noise, sometimes it arrives quietly, takes a seat, and speaks with clarity. And long after the courtroom lights were turned off and the benches emptied, the impact remained, living on in conversations, in awareness, and in the growing belief that even in the most unlikely moments, justice can rise, sit tall, and be seen.